Hello again. Long time no see. I'm upset they cut out of the clip the moment when the reporter, or there are several moments when he called you the oldest man he knows, right, Michael?
Well, maybe the wisest too, right?
Right, okay. Well, since you're the oldest one up here on the stage, I'll start with you. First, can you familiarize us with the suit that you spearheaded and have filed, and really sort of what the takeaways are and how you kind of combine two seemingly distinct issues of civics education and a right to education?
Okay, well, last year we did file a federal lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in Providence, Rhode Island, claiming that students in Rhode Island and throughout the United States have a right under the U.S. Constitution to an education that's adequate to prepare them to be capable citizens. And the reason this is important is that back in 1973, 46 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court issued what was at the time a surprising ruling that said there is no right to education under the U.S. Constitution. Following that, there have been a lot of litigations in 47 out of the 50 states in the state courts, and there have been mixed results. I'm from New York. We won our case in New York and Rhode Island, and about 40% of the states, they lost their case. So there's no uniformity about this. And specifically, when it comes to civics, as Luis Dubé from iCivics mentioned in the prior panel, it's a very low priority, and it has been for the last 40 or 50 years. Now, the reason we brought this lawsuit at this time is, even though the majority of the court held that education is not a right under the U.S. Constitution, that case had to do with the financing of education, they did leave one opening. It was a close 5-4 decision. The dissenter said, okay, there's not a word about education in the federal Constitution, but there is a 15th Amendment that says all citizens have a right to vote. There is a First Amendment that said all people have a right to petition the government to freely express themselves. And you cannot exercise those important constitutional rights without some basic level of education. The court left that question open because the plaintiffs at the time hadn't presented evidence to it. And for a variety of reasons, we decided the time has come to test that opening. So that's why we've brought this case. We brought it in Rhode Island for a bunch of reasons, but I think it has national significance if we can climb the ladder and get the Supreme Court to take the case.
Yeah, and I want to get back to that legal strategy later because it's fascinating. It's really unprecedented and really creative. But first, let's have you, Ahmed. Tell us about your experience in school. I know you're now, you've graduated. Congratulations, that was last year, right?
Thank you, yeah.
Yeah, or this year, but we spoke last year.
Yeah.
You were a senior then. So tell them what your experience in school was like.
Sure. So from a very young age, I first started in public school. And I very soon realized, like by second grade, that public school wasn't right for me. The class sizes were far too large, teacher attention was far too low, and my parents were told by a doctor, that I had ADHD and I couldn't focus in class and things like that, so I went to a private school. And in my private school, there was 2 teachers per classroom. There were a lot less students in the classes. There were more breaks, more free time, one-on-one attention. I could come to school on the weekend if I needed to learn something that I was falling behind on. So I went to private school from 3rd grade up until high school. And then I went to the best high school in my state. The ranking sometimes changes, but classical high school, the best high school in Providence, Rhode Island, at least I can say that for a fact. But even the best high school in my state still had a lot of glaring disparities. First of all, the building was horrendous. They would always have buckets collecting like drainage from the ceilings, falling ceiling tiles, brown water in the bubblers, but that's not even anything to do with the quality of the education I was learning. I will remember before graduating, a couple weeks before, I was handing in some late work because my attendance senior year, senioritis happens. And one of my teachers was like, my math teacher, I hope she's watching this, she was like, you should be in jail with your attendance. And you look at me, I don't know why like a white woman would like think that that's her place to be like, oh, you should be in jail. But then she followed. She was like, actually, you're not 18 yet. Your parents should be in jail. And I was like, with your level of education, with your level of a lens on how to teach people and how to be a compassionate person, you should know that your job is to empower me and not to, kind of question, or not to kind of make me seem like I'm a bad person because of things in my life that I can't control, like a job, like trying to complete all these classes and trying to get all this work done. So that experience a couple weeks before I graduated was really what cemented the need for this work. I've always been very inclined to speak for issues and to talk about things that affect me in my life. But I think that one thing that people need to realize is that stories are very important. You guys are all in this room because you realize that stories are important and you're listening to people's stories. But the dialogue is the first part. The direct action is the thing that's really going to change it. That's why I think this case is really important, because it's kind of a no-brainer. Everyone who is in this country came here for a better life, for a better experience. I know that firsthand because my parents were fleeing a Liberian civil war. From the beginning of colonialism, discovery doctrine, all that stuff, civics has been necessary. We want people to live together, and we want people to be happy, and we want a country that is productive, the richest, best country in the world. But we need to address the fact that the country was built on a system that was built by people who had other people doing the work of building the country for them. And they had time to write these rules and codify these things. So how do we change that? And I think civics is very important because civics affects every single facet of life, not just politics, education, real estate, finance, healthcare. All these things are affected by civics and politics and laws. And people often think politics are don't ask, don't tell. In elementary school, when I asked my teachers about voting, they were like, yeah, we can't really talk about that. I can't tell you who I voted for. But this stuff affects people's lives, and you guys know that firsthand because we're in the Capitol.
I imagine you didn't get any civics education in school, that you got it elsewhere. You had to.
I got civics education in my middle school, which was community preparatory school in the south side of Providence. It was very intentional in making sure that historically underserved students got a leg up. So that's how I got into classical, really, because at community prep, I was really challenged and it was rigorous, and I really did get a leg up there. They had me do a history project that was like a magazine, as if I had went back in time and talking about like the laws of the time. And I think the era that I chose was like Jim Crow era. So like all these things are things that need to be talked about, but they're really hard discussions to just start out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Michael, I've described your suit as a bank shot argument. I know we had some disagreement about that description, but blame it on my editor. How did you piece the lawsuit together? How did you really decide that you're going to take civics education and use it as a means of really advancing your sort of longer campaign for institutionalizing a rights education in this country?
Well, I actually got interested in the issue of civic education, or the lack thereof, from a lawsuit I brought in New York State. We won a big victory that said kids in New York State have a right under the state constitution to a sound basic education. And the court defined sound basic education as the skills kids need to function productively as civic participants. And that really startled me. I said, wow, the court is saying that the most important thing in education is preparing kids for citizenship. And then as we got a lot more money for schooling in New York State as a result of this case, but when I looked at what was happening years after we had won, nothing had changed in civics. When there were cutbacks in funding, the first thing to go were all the extracurricular activities, experiential activities of visiting city councils, legislators, the kinds of debating and mock trials that were talked about. All that is the first to go. It's the lowest priority. But our state court said it should be the highest priority. And I went and researched this. There are 32 highest state courts that have said the most important, or one of the most important purposes of education is preparing kids for good citizenship. You go back historically, that's what John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and all our founders said. So there's a link to history and what people who think about this hard, which is what judges do, say in the 21st century. But you look at our schools, and it's the lowest priority. So that's when I decided we've got to do something about it. And I started thinking about what to do about it. I was aware of this opening the court left, that they hadn't faced this issue 46 years ago, and the time seemed right. God knows we need more civic education for our kids today. We need it for the adults, but you got to work with the coming generation. So that's why we decided this is the time that's right to bring the suit. People ask me, what is the composition of the Supreme Court? Are they going to be open to this? This is not a partisan issue. Whether you're conservative, liberal, I think you have a reason to want our kids to know about the rule of law, to know about the separation of powers, to know how the Constitution works. So that's what this is about. And Rhode Island, unfortunately, has one of the worst education systems, certainly when it comes to civics. They don't require any course in civics. They have minimal requirements in history. So that's why we decided to bring the case in Rhode Island. But we really see it as a test case. And if we prevail on this, the ruling will affect all kids in the United States because it's a federal case.
Just a reminder to submit your questions if you have them, and we can get to them at the end of this conversation. But just to follow up on the focus on Rhode Island, it's not a state that I think, at least for me, I'm an education reporter, it wasn't admittedly on my radar. And I guess the issues, once I really read up on the state, they're egregious. There was a recent report out, right? And so you gave us a pretty vivid image of what your school is like.
Sure.
Yeah, what are Rhode Island schools like? What is the education system like?
Well, thanks, Johns Hopkins. They recently did a really extensive report on the state of Rhode Island schools, and they said they were worse than New York, worse than the worst districts. And it's wild because I graduated from there. I was pushed through there.
You went to the best school.
And I went to the seemingly best school in the state. I think one thing that always gets people when they think about the state of current education is that they say there's a lack of teachers and there's a lack of support for teachers. But I think that school needs to prepare more students to want to be teachers. There's so many ways that students just don't feel accepted at their schools, or they don't feel really valued, they don't feel heard, and they're the people who have to be at school for like 8 hours every single day for most of their year. I don't really think there's a scarcity of people that want to do this work to teach people about, or to teach the youth about how to change the world that they're growing into. I just think that we need to support it more. I think that the dialogue is helpful, but it's just a start, and more institutions need to start thinking about how to facilitate growth for teaching professionals, because education is like the way you see your lens through life. And I grew up not really questioning systemic oppression, or not really questioning why corporations are so laxly regulated. And these are things that are pivotal to America, and these are things that I personally don't think are sustainable. I don't know if you all think these things are sustainable, but the systems and the way that things are set up currently need to be changed by the people who actually live in them, and not just the people who have the power to control them. And I think that's what civics at its core, for me as a person of color, for me as somebody who has dealt with poverty, for me as somebody who has dealt with an education system, a healthcare system, legal system, all these things that are rigged against people just because of some arbitrary rules that were made up by somebody. I think that civics is the way that you start to get students to think critically about certain things, think critically about how certain institutions keep certain people out, and then we can start to change them when students actually understand how they work.
So the first question from the audience, it's actually a good segue from that. How does promoting school integration tie into civics education in K-12, particularly since schools are most segregated and minority kids are over-policed?
Well, what I think I can say in response to that, we define civic education very broadly in this case. It's not just having a class in the 12th grade or the 8th grade. It means providing kids a deep knowledge of history, of how the government works. It means analytic skills, critical analytical skills. It means learning democratic values. It means experiential opportunities. And it means living in a civic society, which means a diverse society. So one aspect of our suit is we are promoting diversity in schools, and we think that's an obligation of Rhode Island and all states. It's a different way. We're not asking the court to overrule a lot of their precedents directly talking about racial integration, but indirectly, if you take civics seriously, you've got to take a whole new approach to integrating people of all backgrounds, and whether we're talking about race, religion, economic status, that is important.
How can civics education not be a partisan issue when one political party thrives on misinformation and disenfranchising voters who don't fit into their demographic? Easy question.
Not an easy question, but I'll tell you, one of the other things we push for, and again, it's a central aspect of the suit, is what's called media literacy. Mm-hmm. And I submit this is not a partisan issue. Kids in the 21st century need to know how to use social media and the internet in a responsible, educated way. They do have to know how to separate accurate from inaccurate information. They do have to probe beyond a website and understand who put up the website, where they're coming from, what their agenda might be. And in the long run, that is going to serve all of us, Republican, Democratic. So we're not looking at today's headlines. We're looking for the future. We're looking for the next generation to be well educated throughout the 21st century.
Perfect. Well, we're all done, but there was one question. It wasn't really a question for you. It was asking you if you can be a teacher. So can you?
Maybe. We'll
Cool.
see. We'll see.
Hope to see you in classrooms. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.